Hello, I'm Mary Jane McArea, and I've been with Servas as a volunteer in many positions since 1977. I first met Bob in 1980 because U.S. Service had its first national meeting outside of New York City. Even Bob Luitweiler came to it. Before he was assigned to stay with somebody, he brought 2 suitcases of raw corn. When he came, not only are you organizing a conference for San Francisco and everybody from out of state, you also have to organize the food, and now you have to have this fresh corn, 2 suitcases of fresh corn cooked. I mean, it was a very nice idea, but oh my goodness, what a challenge. I found out that he was not very welcome because when they had group meetings, he had very strong ideas how Servas should be.
I feel that Servas has degenerated into a program for bourgeois middle-class society and not very concerned with the basic social problems that are causing war. In the beginning, when we were in Birmingham and we're talking about the future of Servas, we saw it as a system where young people who wanted to work for peace would go to other countries and learn ways that people were solving their problems in other countries.
The board, I don't know what he said to the board so that they were not welcoming, but he got his say in. He is able to engage you as a founder of what it is that he wants, and he wanted more peace activities. He wanted more participation, and I think that's what the local groups are being encouraged to do, to get involved in local activities that bring people together to have fun and at the same time support activism of humanitarian ilk or some environmental, you name the kind of peace.
I remember, in the early, before he died in the 2000s, he was very much pushing again. He was upset that Servas had become more of a travel organization rather than a peace-building organization. So he was pushing the peace-building part again. I think he went to, either UN conference or something like that, and proposed that, again, the emphasis be on peace-building, and ambassadorship as opposed to the more travel aspect. So that was his, and that was his, his mission. And he was trying to reignite that mission in Servas, so a few years before he died.
He comes from a very upscale New York family, and he was a different kind of a child. He wanted to know why, and he was argumentative, quote, argumentative in the sense that he wanted to know more and more and more. And he just didn't fit in with his family. There were 2 children, he and his brother. And so I think they sent him off to a military school, and he didn't fit in there. So he was made to know early on that his behavior as a nonconformist was very challenging to the family. And he learned to live with that, and I think that's why it made him, or prepared him, to be a leader that didn't go along with the group. So off he goes. During the Second World War, he was a conscientious objector. He was put into prison. So good old Bob, he's the kind that's in your face. I mean, you are talking to him and he wants to get up close and personal. And so he went over and he saw some people who didn't know, 2 black nationalists from the South. So he goes to them and he says, tell me about yourself. So he's not a kind of person that's going to they want to ignore you. No. He says he wants to know, he asks some specific questions, and He's so close to you, you cannot ignore him. So he asked these two men about why they're black nationalists. Turns out he's the first white person they've ever talked to, and he asked them more about their beliefs and so on, and that why should they go to war if they don't even have any rights if they're in the South? All right. So after 3 months, these two young men said, are there more white people like you? So what he has done has opened the mind of these two black people that all white people are the same. He showed them that all white people aren't the same. And he goes, wow, just by talking you can change people's hearts and minds.
Every person grows up in an ethnic cage. Mm-hmm. The ideas and the values and the language and everything that they grow up with is good in one way, but in other ways it puts a cocoon around them where they are limited in their understanding of the larger picture and the larger world. Mm-hmm. And I felt that Servas was a way to help people get out of their ethnic cage and see the humanity as a whole.
He was in jail, he was let out of jail, and of course when civil service, the selective service called him back in after he had not gone, his number came up again and he refused to go again. He was put in jail a second time for being a conscientious objector. All right, now the war is over and he gets out of jail because he wasn't selected anymore. So he goes over to Denmark, and now Europe is a mess. I mean, everything has been bombed out. There is no infrastructure, there is no public transportation, there's nothing. So this is the story that Bob says. He went to the folk school someplace in Denmark, and everybody's hitchhiking, so he meets this girl from Germany, and of course, in Bob's say, well, what do you think about the Jews? He says to this young girl. She says, oh, everybody knows the Jews are like this, that, and the other. He says, you're just prejudiced. He says, how many Jews do you know? She says, I don't know any. He says, well, then unless you know them, how you cannot say all those things about it, otherwise you're prejudiced. He says, oh, I can make arrangements for you to stay with some Jews. Would you do that? Oh, yes. Would you report back to me? Oh, yes. All right. So she goes and stays with this Jewish family for 2 nights, comes back and reports. How was your visit? Oh, they were just wonderful. They talked about Judaism, but you could tell they weren't Jews. The next thing, he says, well, why don't you go again? I'll set up another kind of homestay program. She said, okay. So he sets up another homestay. They go, and she comes back, and she says, oh, it was very interesting. They talked about Jewish practices. They showed me menorah, and they showed me all these different things, but it was like a living museum, except you can tell they weren't Jewish. And he says, oh, is that right? Well, we'll try one more time. So she goes to the third family, and she comes back, and she says, Bob, don't ask me. I get it. They're just people. And he said, oh, my goodness. So if just talking to these black nationalists and this young lady from Germany who meets people she had previous ideas about, just like the black nationalists did, you can change the hearts and minds of people.
When I question it, they say, well, meeting people from other countries is creating peace. And I say, sure. I said, American Civil War, they were shooting each other, and some of them were cousins or even brothers. And knowing each other doesn't necessarily make peace. But they don't want to hear that, and I've never heard them argue it. They just forget it.
And then he said, oh, this is Whatcom County is a farming community, and it's changing. So he said, no, let's go talk to some farmers. Well, this is in the evening, so we go to a chain restaurant at one of the shopping malls, something like Sari's, I think is the name of it. I think that's a chain of restaurants, something like that. And we walked in, and he'd walk through the booths and look at people and say, hey, well, I got these people from California, they're visiting, and they'd like to know about what's it like to be a farmer here in Whatcom County. So he'd start talking to these people while they were having dinner or whatever. He'd start interrupting them to, start chatting them up about their lives, and their livelihood and farming. So I thought this was a little abrupt. It took lots of cojones to walk up to people and just start the conversation. But obviously it became obvious this is what Bob did all the time. I'd see him in the park every once in a while, and he'd be talking to people, and obviously they were foreigners because maybe people dressed in saris or something like that, and he'd always be engaged in people.
When I go to another country, to me the most interesting thing isn't the cities, they're all very much similar, but to go out into the villages and get to know the village craftspeople, right, and to get to know the village farmers and the children, and their life and their customs. That's exciting. And that experience was what convinced me that Servas could be a powerful educational program. And jumping ahead, when we were in Birmingham, England, we specified that Servas was not a hospitality program, but a work-study travel program, which is fundamentally different.
Right.
And the people that traveled used it would be fundamentally different.
He starts this group called Peace Builders. And Peace Builders had three foci. One was homestays, but that wasn't the main one. The main one was work camps, because all of the world was falling apart and everybody needed help rebuilding, and that was community action program. And the third one was homestays. Work camps, peace activism, and homestays. The work camps have gone because they're hard to find these days, so there's only homestays and peace activism left. And it changes its name from Peace Builders to Servas, I don't know what year. In Esperanto was the language, supposed to be the international language, so they used to serve, Servas. So he goes and talks to all these organizations and say, I have this idea about continuing what you were supporting beforehand, and it's called Peace Builders or Servas. And that's how he, using the lists and going around talking about it, got Servas started in Europe.
Peace Builders teams. It wasn't mine, it was a Quaker idea in U.S. The idea that people in a particular community would come together and form this kind of sharing team that I was telling about. They would both have intercultural learning and at the same time have a project to go out and do something constructive for the community.
Bob Luitweiler had started it in a folk school in Denmark. So we went up there too, and we were also interested in communities. So we found a Servas host that also lived in the community outside of our house. And that was basically a co-housing community. So we went to visit the folk school, and it was like adult education as adult schools, and people could take some time off and study what interested them. And you thought, well, this will be sort of a funky little place like free schools were in the United States, but no, it was a beautiful building, well furnished, which really surprised us because it obviously had good funding, government funding, and it was one of the things that were encouraged. People were encouraged to continue lifelong learning. And there we found out, that Bob had stayed there sometime after the war and came up with the idea of doing Servas, so it would help bring peace, reintegrate Germans to the rest of Europe, and how they could do one-on-one meeting. And I gather the idea was, in those days, Germans didn't have any hard currency, so they couldn't leave the country because they had no one paying for their trips. So this was an idea, well, if people host you, then you don't need to have money, at least for that part. You may still need money to buy a train ticket or something else, unless you're hitching, which I think is what Bob was doing all the time. Everybody's hitching all over. So, from what I remember reading the history a few years later, they had a Servas meeting someplace in Germany, and fleshed out the organization a little bit more, and it became, it was called peacebuilders or something to that effect at the beginning of their organization. And it was just, and its, the main purpose was to encourage dialogue and to build peace.
I can imagine on all the college campuses around the world, peace builders teams that are part of Servas, where the students come together and they work on issues like environmental issues and race relations. And basically what I think is peace building is dealing with the causes of war. It's not just shouting, war's wrong, I'm going to refuse to fight. It is building a society where people aren't using each other.
He loved talking to young people, and he wanted to know, what did they think about this? Have they thought about that? How about the environment? He was very concerned about the environment, about education and how people were being educated, and how peace was being left out of Servas, and how we could get more active in Servas.
Yes, thinking back, it takes, obviously that was within his character, and it takes that kind of push and desire to, to make something, to build an organization like Servas, to keep at it and keep pushing at it. I mean, he met people all over the world, and he just did it by walking up to him and saying, hi, what you doing, where you at, so that was in his character, and that's how he did it.
Believing in the goodness of all people, by recognizing everybody has a divine light within them, and by recognizing that reaching out and helping them to understand the best in themselves, they can solve all kinds of problems other people couldn't come near solving.